The year was 1885, and the loneliness of the high plains was a physical thing, a weight that settled on Arthur McBride's shoulders as surely as his worn leather suspenders. It was in the endless sigh of the wind across the grama grass, in the vast, indifferent blue of the sky, and most of all, in the profound silence of his cabin after his 3 children were asleep. Grief, he had learned, was not a visitor. It was a tenant that had moved in the day he buried his wife, Martha, and it had never paid a cent of rent. His life was a litany of hard-bitten chores that began before the sun bruised the eastern horizon and ended long after it had bled out in the west. He was a man whittled down to his essential parts, a father, a rancher, a survivor. His small spread was pinched between the unforgiving rock of the mesas and the whisper of Navajo territory, a place most settlers avoided. But the land had been cheap, and with 3 mouths to feed, cheap was the only language Arthur could afford to speak. There was Clara, his eldest at 12, who had taken on the solemn gravity of a woman twice her age, her hands already chapped from lye soap and hard work. She was his shadow and his memory, a living echo of her mother's quiet competence. Henry, at 8, was a bundle of wiry energy and unanswered questions, his freckled face a constant map of curiosity and mischief. And then there was Rose, 5 years old, a sunbeam in the dusty corners of their life, whose laughter was the only currency that still held any real value. They were his reason and his burden, the anchors that kept him from drifting away on the tide of his own sorrow. His days were a rhythm of mending fences that the wind seemed determined to unravel, tending to a small herd of cattle whose ribs showed like counting beads, and coaxing a meager garden from the stubborn soil. He moved with a heavy deliberation, his body aching with a weariness that went deeper than muscle. He was a man running a race against the changing seasons, against failing equipment, and against the ever-present specter of not having enough. The stasis of his existence was a slow grind, a chipping away at the man he had once been, leaving behind a stoic shell that housed a hollowed-out heart. On a blistering afternoon in late summer, when the air shimmered with heat and the world seemed to hold its breath, Arthur rode out to check the northern boundary of his property. It was a desolate stretch where his land met a tangle of cedar and rock that spilled into the lands of the Daine, the Navajo people. He carried his rifle, more out of habit than expectation. The silence was absolute, broken only by the creak of his saddle and the buzz of a lone horsefly. It was a sound that broke the stillness, a sound that did not belong. It was not the cry of a coyote or the shriek of a hawk. It was a choked, guttural sound of pain, sharp and then muffled, as if bitten back. It came again, weaker this time. Arthur reined in his horse, every sense honed by years of solitude. He listened, his head cocked, his gaze sweeping the jagged terrain. He dismounted, tethering his horse to a juniper tree, and moved forward on foot, his boots crunching softly on the dry earth. The sound led him to a narrow, shaded arroyo, a deep scar in the land. And there, in the dappled light, he saw her. She was on the ground, half hidden by overgrown sagebrush, a young Navajo woman. Her dark hair was a spill of polished jet against the pale dust, and her face, contorted in agony, was beautiful even in its distress. One of her legs was caught, horribly, in the rusted jaws of a bear trap. It was an old one, a cruel relic left by some long-gone trapper, forgotten until this terrible moment. It had clamped down high on her calf, the metal teeth sunk deep into flesh and bone. Blood stained her deerskin dress and pooled in the dust beneath her. For a long moment, Arthur stood frozen, the implications of the scene crashing down on him. A white man finding an injured Navajo woman on this contested border was a spark dangerously close to a powder keg. The sensible thing, the safe thing, was to turn around, ride away, and pretend he had seen nothing. His children's faces flashed in his mind. He was their only protection. But then he looked at the woman. Her eyes, dark and fierce, met his. They were filled with defiance and unbearable pain, but not a shred of pleading. She was trying to pull her leg free, her hands slick with her own blood, a low gasp tearing from her throat with the effort. He could not leave her. The part of him that was Martha's husband, that was Clara's and Henry's and Rose's father, the part that was still a decent man despite all the world had done to him, would not allow it. He holstered his rifle, a deliberate gesture to show he meant no harm, and slowly raised his hands, palms open. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "I can help." Her eyes narrowed with suspicion. She stopped struggling and watched him, her body tense as a drawn bowstring, ready for a final, desperate fight. He saw the intricate silver and turquoise jewelry at her throat and wrists, the fine beadwork on her moccasins. She was not just any woman. There was an air of nobility about her, an undeniable pride that even this brutal agony could not extinguish. Arthur approached slowly, as he would a spooked horse. "The trap," he said, pointing. "I have to get it open." He knelt a cautious distance away, studying the mechanism. It was old and rusted tight. It would take all his strength to pry the jaws apart. "This is going to hurt," he said, more to himself than to her. He knew she likely didn't understand his words, but the tone, he hoped, conveyed his intent. He moved closer, his hands reaching for the release springs. She flinched, a hiss of pain and warning escaping her lips. He paused, his gaze meeting hers again. "Let me help," he repeated softly. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not trust, but a desperate acknowledgement of her own helplessness. She gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. Putting his knee against the base of the trap for leverage, he gripped the cold, rusted steel. He pulled, his muscles straining, the cords in his neck standing out. Sweat beaded on his forehead and trickled into his eyes. The rust fought him, groaning in protest. The woman let out a sharp cry as the movement sent a fresh wave of agony through her leg. Arthur gritted his teeth and pulled harder, pouring every ounce of his strength into the task. For a terrifying second, he thought it wouldn't budge. Then, with a loud crack, the jaws gave way, opening just enough. "Now," he grunted, and with his free hand, he carefully worked her leg out from between the metal teeth. The wound was grievous, a deep, mangled crescent of torn flesh. As soon as she was free, she collapsed back against the dirt, her breath coming in ragged sobs, her fierce pride finally broken by a wave of shock and pain. Arthur knew she couldn't walk. Leaving her here was still a death sentence. Coyotes, infection, the unforgiving sun, they would finish what the trap had started. There was only one choice, and it was the one that led straight back to his home, straight back to his children, bringing this dangerous new reality with him. He tore a strip from his own shirt, creating a makeshift bandage to try and slow the bleeding. As he gently wrapped the wound, her head lolled to the side, and she lost consciousness. He carried her back to his horse, his arms straining with the unexpected weight. She was light, but it was a dead weight, and the journey back to the cabin felt miles longer than the journey out. He managed to get her situated in front of him on the saddle, her head resting against his chest. Her breath was shallow against his shirt. As he rode, he felt like a man who had just picked up a lightning bolt, unsure of where or when it would choose to strike. The children were playing in the yard when he rode in. They stopped, their mouths falling open at the sight of the unconscious woman in their father's arms. Clara's face tightened with worry, while Henry's eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and awe. Little Rose hid behind her sister's skirt. "Clara, get the door," Arthur commanded, his voice tight. "Henry, fetch me the clean cloths from the chest and a bucket of water from the well, now." They scrambled to obey, their childish games forgotten. Arthur carried the woman inside and laid her gently on his own cot, the only proper bed in the small two-room cabin. The space suddenly felt crowded, charged with a new, potent energy. He worked quickly, his movements economical and sure. He cut away the blood-soaked part of her dress to expose the wound. It was worse than he'd thought. The teeth had torn deep. Clara returned with a basin of water and clean linen, her face pale but her hands steady. She stood beside him, a silent apprentice. "Is she?" Clara started, her voice a whisper. "She's alive," Arthur said, "but she's hurt bad." Together, they cleaned the wound as best they could. Arthur knew enough about animal injuries to know that a wound like this, left by dirty, rusted metal, was a breeding ground for poison in the blood. He found the small bottle of carbolic acid he kept for doctoring livestock and, after a moment's hesitation, diluted it and used it to disinfect the injury. The woman moaned in her unconscious state, but did not wake. He bound the leg tightly with clean cloths, his touch surprisingly gentle. For the rest of the evening, an uneasy quiet settled over the cabin. The woman, whose name he did not know, drifted in and out of a feverish sleep. Arthur sat in a chair beside the cot, watching her, the rifle now resting against the wall nearby. He was acutely aware of what he had done. He had brought a part of the wild, unknown world across his threshold. He had invited trouble to sit at his hearth. He could feel the judgment of his neighbors in the town 10 miles away, could hear their whispers already. Got himself mixed up with an Indian. The children were quiet, their usual evening chatter silenced. They ate their simple supper of beans and cornbread without a word, their eyes darting between their father and the still figure on the cot. Later, as Arthur tucked Rose into the small bed she shared with Clara, she looked up at him, her blue eyes wide. "Is the pretty lady going to wake up, Papa?" "I hope so, Sweet Pea," he whispered, his heart aching. "I surely hope so." He sent Henry and Clara to bed and resumed his vigil. The woman's fever rose through the night. He bathed her forehead with cool water, forcing spoonfuls of broth between her dry lips when she stirred. In the flickering lamplight, he studied her face. It was a strong face, with high cheekbones and a proud, firm jaw. Even in the depths of her fever, there was an indomitable quality to her. He found himself wondering about her life, her family, the world she came from that was so close and yet so alien to his own. He was tending to a stranger, yet he felt a strange, protective bond forming, forged in the violence of her rescue and the shared vulnerability of this long, quiet night. He must have dozed off, for he awoke with a start to the first grey light of dawn. The woman was awake. Her dark eyes were open, clear of fever, and fixed on him. The suspicion was still there, but it was tempered with a weary curiosity. She pushed herself up slightly, wincing as she moved her injured leg. "Desba," she said, her voice a low, musical rasp. She touched her own chest. "Arthur," he replied, touching his. It was their first exchange, a simple offering of names across a vast cultural divide. He brought her a cup of water, and she drank it gratefully. The silence that followed was not as tense as before. It was a silence of observation, of two people taking measure of one another in the pale morning light. It was Henry who saw them first. He had gone out to the privy and came running back inside, his face ashen. "Papa," he hissed, his voice trembling. "Papa, come quick." Arthur was on his feet in an instant, grabbing his rifle. He moved to the door and peered out. His blood ran cold. The horizon, which had been empty moments before, was now dark with them. Warriors, dozens of them on horseback, sitting motionless, their figures stark silhouettes against the rising sun. They were armed with rifles and bows, their faces painted, their presence a silent, overwhelming threat. At their head sat an older man with a face like a carved rock, his bearing regal and commanding. He wore a headdress of eagle feathers that signified great authority. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. The lightning bolt was about to strike. He glanced back at Desba. She had pulled herself to a sitting position, and there was a look of alarm on her face. "My children," Arthur said, his voice low and urgent, gesturing them to the back room. "Stay there. Do not make a sound." Clara, her eyes wide with terror, herded her younger siblings away from the door, her own fear secondary to her duty to protect them. Arthur took a deep breath, trying to steady his shaking hands. He could not show fear. He was a father protecting his home. He leaned his rifle against the inside of the doorframe, where he could reach it, but it was not in his hands, and stepped out onto the porch. He stood there alone, a solitary figure in a worn work shirt, facing a small army. The riders did not move. They simply watched him, their collective gaze a heavy, palpable force. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the yard. The air was thick with a silence that screamed. Finally, the leader, the man with the eagle feathers, urged his horse forward, halting just beyond the crude fence that marked Arthur's yard. He was followed by 2 other warriors, who stopped a few paces behind him. The chief's eyes, dark and piercing, scanned everything. They took in the small, weathered cabin, the scrawny chickens scratching in the dust, the patched roof. They lingered on the open doorway, and then they settled on Arthur. It was a gaze that seemed to peel back a man's skin and look right into his soul, weighing his worth, judging his spirit. Arthur met the gaze and held it, his posture straight, his hands loose at his sides. He would not be the first to look away. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The tension was a physical coil in Arthur's gut. He thought of his children huddled inside, of Martha, of the promise he'd made to keep them safe. He had brought this upon them with a single act of compassion. He braced himself for the accusation, for the demand, for the violence he was sure was coming. Just then, the cabin door creaked open. Desba stood there, leaning heavily on the doorframe. She had fashioned a crude crutch from a broken chair rung. Her face was pale, but her eyes were bright and clear. She looked at the chief, and a torrent of Navajo words spilled from her lips. Her voice was strong, carrying across the silent yard. She spoke for a long time, her hands gesturing toward the arroyo where he'd found her, toward her bandaged leg, and then toward Arthur. The chief, who Arthur now understood must be her father, listened without interruption. His stern expression did not change, but his eyes shifted from his daughter back to Arthur, and this time the look was different. It was less a judgment and more a deep, searching assessment. When Desba finished speaking, she remained in the doorway, a silent witness to what would happen next. The chief, whose name Arthur would later learn was Hosteen, spoke for the first time. His voice was deep, like the rumble of distant thunder. He spoke in his own tongue, and one of the warriors beside him translated into halting, heavily accented English. "She is Desba, my daughter," the translator said, his eyes hard. "She says you freed her from the Iron Tooth. She says you brought her to your home, that you cleaned her wound, that you gave her water." Arthur simply nodded, his throat too dry to speak. Hosteen spoke again, a longer stream of words. The translator listened, then turned back to Arthur. "Our trackers followed the trail. We found the trap. We found your boot prints next to her blood. We came expecting to find her body and to take payment for it from you and your children." A cold dread washed over Arthur. He had been right to be afraid. That had been their intent. He stood his ground. The chief's gaze fell upon the neatly wrapped bandage on Desba's leg, visible in the doorway. He looked at Arthur's home again, seeing it differently now, not as the hovel of an intruder, but as the shelter that had saved his child. He saw the poverty, the struggle, the evidence of a hard life. And he saw the man who, despite having every reason to fear them, had chosen kindness. Hosteen spoke a final time, his voice softer, laced with a tone of authority that required no translation. The translator's expression was one of clear disbelief. He hesitated, as if unsure how to phrase the words. "Our law demands that a life debt be honored," he said slowly. "You have saved the daughter of a chief. This creates a debt that cannot be ignored. My chief, he does not wish to be in debt to a white man." Arthur braced himself. He expected an offer of horses, perhaps blankets, the traditional currency of such transactions. It would be a welcome relief, but it wouldn't solve the fundamental problem of his life, the crushing, relentless loneliness and the struggle to keep his family from starving. "He sees you are a man alone with your children," the translator continued, his voice heavy with the weight of the message. "He sees your herd is thin and your fields are dry. The winter will be hard for you." The translator paused, looking from his chief to Arthur. My chief, Hosteen, makes you this offer. My people will give you 20 head of cattle and 10 sacks of corn. We will ensure no harm comes to you or your family from our lands. We will consider the debt paid." Arthur's mind reeled. It was a fortune, it was survival, it was more than he could have dreamed of. A wave of relief so profound, it almost buckled his knees washed over him. I accept," he managed to say. "Thank you." But the translator held up a hand. "That is the first part of the offer. There is a condition." Arthur's hope faltered. Of course there was. "My daughter's leg is badly injured. She cannot ride. To move her now would risk the poison taking hold or the bone healing crooked. It is a journey of 2 days back to our camp. She needs to stay where she is, to heal where she is safe." The translator's gaze was intense. "The offer stands only if you allow Desba to remain in your care, under your roof, until she is strong enough to return to us. You will protect her as you have already done. You will give her shelter. In return, you will have our protection and our provision. The debt will be honored through this shared responsibility." It was an offer that would change everything. It was not just about cattle and corn. It was about weaving his life, however temporarily, into the fabric of theirs. It meant defying every prejudice he had ever known and inviting the scorn of his own people. It meant this strange, proud, beautiful woman would remain in his home, in the center of his solitary life. He looked from the implacable face of the chief to the doorway where Desba stood watching him, her dark eyes holding a question he could not yet decipher. He thought of the long, empty evenings, the silent meals, the heavy weight of his grief. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of something other than loss. It was not quite hope, but it was its cousin. It was possibility. He was being offered more than survival. He was being offered a reprieve from the crushing isolation that had defined his world. Arthur McBride, the struggling single dad, the lonely widower, looked at the Navajo chief and gave a single, firm nod. "She can stay," he said, his voice clear and steady. "She will be safe here." A look of profound relief crossed Desba's face. Chief Hosteen watched Arthur for a long moment more, and then, for the first time, he inclined his head in a gesture of respect. He gave a sharp command, and the warriors, who had been a wall of silent menace, began to turn their horses, their movements fluid and controlled. They flowed back toward the horizon, leaving only the chief and a handful of others behind. The next few weeks fell into a new, unfamiliar rhythm. True to Hosteen's word, 2 young Navajo men delivered a small herd of healthy cattle the next day, their horns glinting in the sun, along with sacks of corn and dried beans that filled Arthur's depleted larder. The threat of the coming winter receded, replaced by a sense of security he hadn't felt in years. But the more significant change was inside the cabin. Desba's presence filled the silence. As her legs slowly healed, she moved from the cot to a chair by the hearth, her hands never idle. She showed Clara how to weave intricate patterns with dyed grasses, her long, graceful fingers moving with a mesmerizing skill. She taught Henry the names of the birds in her own language, her voice a soft melody that warmed the small room. She had a special affinity for little Rose, who would sit at her feet for hours, listening to stories of Coyote and the Star Dancers. Stories that painted a world of magic and wonder over the drab canvas of their lives. Arthur found himself watching her constantly. He watched the way the firelight caught the silver in her bracelets, the way she smiled at his children, a rare, beautiful thing that transformed her proud face. Communication remained a challenge, a patchwork of gestures, single words, and the surprising translations offered by Clara, who seemed to have a natural gift for understanding. But they began to communicate on a deeper level in the shared language of work and care. He would come in from the fields, weary and covered in dust, and find a hot meal waiting, not just his usual beans, but something she had prepared, adding wild herbs she'd instructed Henry to find. She mended their clothes with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She was bringing order and a quiet beauty back into a home that had long been bereft of both. One evening, after the children were asleep, they sat in the quiet glow of the fire. Arthur was cleaning a piece of tack, his hands moving with familiar purpose. Desba was polishing one of her silver bracelets with a soft cloth. "Your wife," she said, her English still hesitant but improving daily. "Clara, she speaks of her." Arthur's hands stilled. He rarely spoke of Martha. The pain was still too close to the surface. He looked into the flames, his throat tight. "Her name was Martha," he said, the name feeling strange on his tongue. She was like Clara, kind and strong. The fever took her 2 years ago." Desba was silent for a long moment. Then she spoke softly. "I lost my mother when I was a girl, a sickness that came with the winter. My father, he became like the mountain, hard and silent. Grief makes a stone of a man's heart." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a profound understanding that transcended words. "But a stone can be warmed by the sun." In that moment, Arthur felt a crack appear in the wall he had built around himself. She saw him, not just as a settler, not just as a father, but as a man hollowed by loss. He saw her not as a Navajo princess or a stranger, but as a woman who knew the same deep sorrow. The isolation he had carried for so long began to feel a little less absolute. As the weeks turned into a month, her leg grew stronger. She could walk with only a slight limp. The day was approaching when her people would come for her. The thought left a strange, hollow ache in Arthur's chest. He had grown used to her presence, to the sound of her voice, to the way the cabin felt less like a shelter and more like a home. One afternoon he found her by the creek, watching Rose chase dragonflies. She stood with a stillness that was part of her nature, a deep connection to the land that he, for all his work upon it, had never felt. "My father will send for me soon," she said, not looking at him. "I know," he replied, his voice quiet. She turned to face him then. "In my world, a home is made by a woman's hands and a man's strength, together. This place, it was a shelter. Now, it is becoming a home." She paused, her gaze steady and direct. "You are a good man, Arthur McBride. Your heart is not made of stone." He didn't know what to say. He could only look at her, at this woman who had been brought to him by a cruel twist of fate, who had endured terrible pain and had repaid it with grace and kindness. He saw the life she had brought back to his home, to his children, and to him. The thought of her leaving was like imagining the sun failing to rise. The day Hosteen and his warriors returned, the air was crisp with the promise of autumn. They did not arrive as a threat, but as an escort. Arthur stood on his porch once more, but this time he was not alone. Desba stood beside him, and his children were clustered near, their faces sad. Hosteen dismounted and approached, his eyes moving between his daughter and Arthur. He saw his daughter was whole and strong again. He saw the healthy cattle grazing on the hill. He saw the look in Arthur's eyes as he gazed at Desba. He spoke to his daughter in their tongue, his voice soft. She replied, her voice clear and firm. She looked at Arthur, then back to her father, and spoke again, a longer speech this time, her tone earnest and full of conviction. Hosteen listened, his expression unreadable. When she was finished, he looked at Arthur for a long, silent minute. Then he spoke to him directly, without a translator, in slow, carefully chosen English. "You have honored the debt," the chief said. "My daughter is healed. You have our thanks." He paused. "She tells me her spirit wishes to stay in this place. She says her home is no longer with us, but here, with you and your children." Arthur's heart stopped. He looked at Desba, who met his gaze with a quiet, hopeful courage. He saw his own future reflected in her eyes, a future that was not empty and silent, but filled with her strength, her warmth, her love. The chief's gaze was piercing. "This is not our way, but my daughter's heart is strong, stronger than my own. If she is to stay, she will not stay as a guest. She will stay as a wife, as the mother of this house." He looked at Arthur, his question unspoken but hanging heavy in the air. This was not an offer of cattle or corn. This was an offer of a life, a family, a future. Arthur McBride looked at the proud chief. He looked at Clara, Henry, and Rose, who were watching him with pleading eyes. And then he looked at Desba, the Navajo woman he had found broken and trapped, who had, in turn, rescued him from a prison of his own. He reached out and took her hand, her fingers curled around his, warm and strong. "Yes," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion, "she is already home." A slow smile spread across Hostein's weathered face. He had not lost a daughter, he had forged an alliance stronger than any treaty, a family bound not by blood or by law, but by an unexpected act of kindness in the heart of the vast, unforgiving West. The land was still hard, and life would still be a struggle, but for the first time since he had laid Martha to rest, Arthur McBride did not have to face it alone. He had a home again.